According to its canonical texts, Buddhism is a non-theistic religion. Rather, the Buddha is famously not supposed to be worshipped as a deity. Instead, the Buddha was just supposed to be a remarkable man who managed to escape the cycle of birth and rebirth by achieving the state of parinirvana. There's just one problem. That's not what most Buddhist practitioners actually believe. So today we're going to be doing some good old-fashioned debunking. And the first of our two debunking exercises concerns this idea of what's called theological incorrectness. What theological incorrectness is a deviance between religion as it appears in Scripture and religion as people actually practice it on the ground. The modernist view of Buddhism as a non-theistic religion, one that's more rooted in a philosophical tradition of spiritual self-reliance, the one that's pervaded Western culture, partially because it's so consistent with post-Enlightenment values, also happens to be consistent with what's actually written in the Buddhist canon, but it's not what we would predict from a cognitive science-informed perspective of religion. And in this case, reality, at least as practiced by the vast majority of Buddhists, happens to be on the side of the psychology rather than on the side of the theology. Buddha is deified and prayed to, as if in some sense he was present and able to hear those prayers. To learn more about this idea of theological incorrectness, we're going to talk to Dr. Jason Sloan, who literally wrote the book on theological incorrectness. It was titled Theological Incorrectness.
Early on in the study of religion, the idea was that if you want to understand what religion was all about, you studied texts. So you studied the Bible, you studied the Quran, you studied the texts of the Asian religions. But starting in the 1960s and 70s, scholars realized that if you really want to understand religion, it's best to go study actual living religious people and talk to them and find out what they believe and do. And lo and behold, what we found out is that lived religion, or religion on the ground, as scholars describe it, is often quite different from religion in the books. We've discovered that there's a gap between what people ought to believe, what people actually believe, and what people ought to do and what people actually do. Playing off the notion of political incorrectness, theological incorrectness is the notion that oftentimes people have beliefs and do practices that are actually in violation of the theologies of their own traditions. And that's actually a pretty common phenomenon we find across cultures and across religions. A very common cross-cultural pattern of theological incorrectness is in folk God concepts. So many theologians of religious traditions think of their gods as all-knowing, all-powerful, and that's what theologians insist that folks believe. And most people believe that they believe that gods are all-powerful, all-knowing, and so forth. But in their daily lives, thinking online or off the cuff, they often treat deities as very much as people, being only able to do one thing at a time. While it's true that people can memorize theologically correct concepts, it doesn't mean that those memorized concepts actually do any work in daily thinking. So when people are reasoning or inferring or making judgments, they'll often default to more basic intuitive kinds of concepts that are part of their natural default cognitive architecture rather than the theologically correct concept that they've memorized. So to really understand religion, it really helps to understand cognition.
Here, we're not talking about a commonly held popular view of religion, but we're talking about one of the early and particularly provocative theories in the cognitive science of religion. This is the supposed mental stickiness of what's called the minimally counterintuitive idea. So every day, for each of us, hundreds and thousands of ideas flow through our minds, and each competes for a share of our attention. Now, some of these ideas prove to be more memorable than others, and they'll also be more likely to be passed down to other people and spread throughout a population. So consider, for example, election campaign slogans. Throughout American history, there have been many, many slogans, and each of them has competed for our attention and mindshare, and only a few of them have proved memorable enough to stick in our heads and invade and colonize public consciousness. So you can think of, "Give me liberty or give me death." "We like Ike." "It's morning again in America." "Yes, we can." "Make America great again." "People over politics." Oh wait, that last one was from George Pataki's run for the Republican nomination in 2016, remember? No? Well, exactly. Now let's talk about this idea of the minimally counterintuitive idea. The suggestion here is that one of the things that made certain religious ideas, say about a miraculous action of a particular religious figure, stand out, is that they weren't completely intuitive. They were a little counterintuitive. Not so counterintuitive that it was really hard to understand them, but counterintuitive enough that they stood out from the din of otherwise completely intuitive, sensible ideas. It was a great idea, and it was a plausible hypothesis. So what happened to it? Well, to find out, let's talk to Dr. Ayanna Willard.
Yeah, so this is early work in the cognitive science of religion done by Pascal Boyer, and it was actually one of the first studies that really brought to light this idea that you could study religion and understand religion by understanding human thought and human cognition, by understanding how we think about the world. It's a very intricate and complex theory, and I think unfortunately as we've learned more about how people think and look at the world and perceive the world, it's sort of not panned out theoretically.
So what was the original idea?
So the original idea was that we have these sort of beliefs that violate our intuitions about the world. So these are kind of unusual things. They don't fit with maybe our scientific understanding of the world. And because they're violating our basic intuitions, we find them more memorable. So an example would be something like Jesus walking on water. We understand that that's not possible. It violates the law of physics. We have a concept of how the world should be, and we violate it a little bit, and it becomes more memorable. If we violate that too much, it becomes just incoherent and hard to think about.
And there's been some recent skepticism about this idea, or some recent lack of support.
So a lot of the things that we do find in religion are things like using mental states to reason about the world, and this seems very intuitive and very natural. It doesn't actually seem like a lot of the ideas in religion are these minimally counterintuitive ones. So you can find examples like Jesus walking on water, but they're actually in the minority. They're not a major part of a lot of religious systems.
Are the minimally counterintuitive ideas actually more memorable?
So there's mixed evidence on this. There's been quite a lot of research that suggests that they are, but as context change, that changes quite a bit. So if you frame something in terms of being a science fiction story or a dream, that memory bias disappears. If you use really complex sentences, that memory bias disappears. So there is some sort of memory bias there, but it's not robust. Much of where the field is turning now is context biases, so cultural transmission and how we learn these sort of cultural structures from other people. So if a certain god or certain spiritual belief is held by a highly prestigious person, we might be more likely to adopt it. If it's credibly displayed, so using some sort of ritual display, or people are making some sort of sacrifice to make that belief seem credible to other people, they're more likely to adopt it. And another one would just be conformity bias. If everybody around you is holding that belief, you're much more likely to adopt it yourself.
So those are more relevant to whether an idea is successful than whether it's minimally counterintuitive, maximally counterintuitive, or just intuitive.
Yeah, definitely.
So the problem with this hypothesis of the minimally counterintuitive idea is that most religious ideas are actually very intuitive, and most counterintuitive ideas don't actually turn out to be religious. Now, what's the point of talking about this all but morbid scientific hypothesis? Well, it's a good example of how science works, as a work in progress. Now, obviously, all our initial hypotheses can't be correct, and if they were, then there would be no reason to actually test the hypotheses. And this is what makes science different from other bodies of knowledge. Every claim is considered provisional, open to testing, and is only as good as the evidence that supports it. There's this quote that I like to use in my Psych 100 class, that data without theory is trivia, but theory without data is bullshit. We should be open to potential bullshit to begin with, but willing to abandon even our most cherished bullshit ideas when the evidence points us in the other direction. The story of the minimally counterintuitive idea is an example of science working. An idea was proposed, and then systematic empirical testing determined whether it was supported by real-world data. In this case, it wasn't. In his Journey to the Center of the Earth, Jules Verne has this line: "Science, my lad, has been built upon many errors, but they are errors which it has been useful to make, for they have been the stepping stones to truth." Now, in the next few lectures, we're going to be talking about a lot of scientific ideas, and we're going to be talking about a lot of scientific evidence that backs up those ideas. But as we do so, you should keep in mind that science is a method, and that the body of evidence we're talking about is a work in progress that is forever provisional, and that only by the accumulation of evidence is it slowly pushed towards the truth.